Why don't you just go check yourself into a shelter, you old freeloader?" Those were the words my son-in-law said to me the moment I pulled out my chair at the dinner table. And the strange thing is, he didn't even raise his voice. He said it the way a man reads a weather report. The table went still. My daughter looked down at her napkin and started folding it into a smaller and smaller square. His parents sat across from me with their hands in their laps, watching, and I swear there was something almost pleased in the way they watched, like they'd bought tickets to a show. All I had done was walk in carrying a peach cobbler I'd baked that afternoon, still warm under the foil. I remember my hand finding the back of the chair, gripping it, and I remember thinking that my daughter would say something now. Any second now. She didn't. So I picked my coat back up off the hook by the door, and I left. What none of them noticed was that on my way out, my grandson slid something into the pocket of my coat. A folded piece of notebook paper. And when I read what that 10-year-old boy had written, I understood that the dinner had never been a dinner at all. If a story like this stirs something in you, even a little, do me a kindness and tap that like button. It helps these stories find the people who need to hear them, and if you've ever sat at a table where the people who were supposed to love you made you feel small, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. Leave your town and the time in the comments, and tell me honestly, would you have walked out the way I did, or would you have stayed and fought? My name is Maeve Sullivan, and I'm 67 years old. I live in a one-bedroom unit in a senior building on the edge of Glenwood, a small town in southern Indiana where the corn comes right up to the back of the parking lot. My apartment isn't much. Thin carpet, a window that sticks in the summer, a little galley kitchen where I can touch both walls at once if I stretch. But it's quiet, and after the life I've lived, quiet is its own kind of wealth. I keep a row of African violets on the sill and a photograph of my late husband on the bookshelf, and most days that's enough. It wasn't always this small. For 31 years, my husband Edward and I ran Sullivan's Hardware on Main Street, right between the bank and the old movie house that closed back in the 90s. It wasn't a fancy place. We sold nails by the pound out of bins, mixed paint by hand, kept a coffee pot going in the back for the farmers who came in to complain about the weather, and buy a single carriage bolt. Edward used to say the store wasn't really a business, it was a front porch with a cash register, and he wasn't wrong. People came in to talk as much as to buy. My daughter Bridget grew up behind that counter. When she was little, she'd sit on an upturned bucket and sort screws into coffee cans, and she was so proud when I let her ring up her first customer that she told everyone at school she had a job. Edward passed 8 years ago. Heart attack in the garage on a Sunday morning while he was supposed to be changing the oil in my car. One minute he was out there with the radio on, and the next minute the radio was just playing to an empty driveway. Losing him took the floor out from under me. For the better part of a year, I kept the store open out of sheer stubbornness, but my heart wasn't in the work anymore, and the big home improvement chain out by the highway had been bleeding us dry for a decade besides, so I sold. The new owners turned it into a place that sells scented candles and signs that say things like live, laugh, love. I don't walk down that block anymore if I can help it. What people assumed when they heard I'd sold was that I'd taken a little money and crawled off to live small. And I let them assume that. But Edward had been the kind of man who read the business pages with his breakfast and didn't trust a thing he couldn't put his hands on. And long before he died, he'd made sure that when the store went, the money wouldn't just sit in a checking account waiting to be frittered away. I'll tell you the rest of that in a minute, because it matters more than I knew at the time. For a while after Edward died, Bridget and I were close. She'd lost her father too, and grief stitched us back together for a season. Then she married Trevor. I want to be fair about it, because resentment makes a person exaggerate, so let me say it plain. Trevor was charming when he wanted to be. He owned a contracting outfit, did kitchen remodels and additions, drove a truck that cost more than my first house. The first time I met him, he called me ma'am and complimented my cobbler and held the door, and I thought, well, all right, maybe. But charm is a thing some men spend like cash, and they only spend it when they're buying something. After the wedding, the small comments started. Trevor would look at my coat and ask if I'd thought about updating my look. When I mentioned I took the bus to my doctor's appointments because I'd stopped driving at night, he laughed and said, "You know they make apps for that now, right? You don't have to live like it's 1962. Bridget would give a little laugh too, a nervous one, and never quite tell him to stop. The comments were small enough that calling them out would have made me the one causing a scene. That's the trick of it. They keep each insult just under the line where you could name it. The one good thing that came out of that marriage was my grandson. Wyatt was born a year in, and the first time the nurse set him in my arms, he gripped my finger and looked up at me like he'd been waiting his whole short life to meet me. He's 10 now, all knees and elbows and serious dark eyes, and he is the smartest person in that family by a wide margin, though none of them have noticed. I used to have him over on Saturdays and we'd bake. He liked the measuring, the precision of it. He'd level off a cup of flour with the back of a knife and tell me, very gravely, that you have to be exact or the whole thing falls apart. He didn't know he was talking about more than baking. Over the last couple of years, even those Saturdays dried up. Trevor and Bridget always seemed to have somewhere to be. Calls went to voicemail. When I did see Wyatt, Trevor hovered, like he didn't want the boy and me to have a minute alone. I told myself families drift, that everyone was busy, that it didn't mean anything. Then, about a month before that dinner, Bridget called me out of nowhere, and her voice had a brightness to it I hadn't heard in years. She said it had been too long, that they wanted to have me over, just family, a nice quiet supper. Trevor's parents would be there, she said, because they were all trying to spend more time together. I sat at my little kitchen table holding the phone and I felt something foolish and hopeful open up in my chest. I said yes before I'd even finished thinking about it. Looking back, there was a rehearsed quality to the way she said it, like she was reading off a card. But a mother hears what she wants to hear. So that evening, I baked Edward's mother's peach cobbler, the one Wyatt loves, and I wrapped it in foil and rode the bus across town to their house, out in the new development where all the homes look like they were stamped out by the same machine. Trevor's truck was in the driveway, and behind it, 2 cars I recognized as belonging to his parents, Roland and Marlene Pierce. I stood on the sidewalk a second too long, holding that warm dish against my coat, telling myself I was being silly. They were family too. Of course they'd be there. Bridget opened the door, and her eyes went straight to the cobbler and then to my coat, and something flickered across her face that I'd call embarrassment if I were being kind. "Oh," she said, "you brought food." "Not thank you, just, you brought food." The house smelled like the roast Trevor's mother had clearly brought, store-bought rolls warming, a candle going somewhere. Roland was at the table already, scrolling his phone. Marlene stood by the counter with a glass of white wine, and when I came in, she looked me up and down, slow, the way you'd appraise a used car you had no intention of buying. Wyatt came barreling around the corner and hugged me around the middle, and for 1 second the whole room was worth it. "You made the cobbler?" he whispered. I told him I sure did. Trevor appeared and put a hand on the boy's shoulder, steering him toward the table, and we all sat. It started gentle. Roland asked me, in a voice like he was doing me a favor by being interested, whether it was true I used to run that little hardware store. I said it was, for 31 years. Marlene said it must have been so hard, working with my hands my whole life, like a body wears out faster that way. I didn't know what to say to that, so I didn't say anything. Then Roland set his fork down and said, in that same easy tone, that he'd been reading about how so many seniors get themselves into trouble managing money, how the mind goes, how families have to step in before it's too late. Trevor nodded along like a man at church. Bridget kept her eyes on her plate. And then Trevor looked at me, and he said the thing about the shelter, about being a freeloader, calm as anything, and the room held its breath. Wyatt's fork hit his plate. I waited for my daughter. She didn't lift her head, so I stood up, and my hands were shaking, but my voice wasn't, and I said good night, and I got my coat, and I walked out. As the door closed behind me, I heard Marlene murmur something about how I only ever showed up for a free meal anyway, and that was the part that followed me down the driveway. I'd just reached the end of the block when I heard sneakers slapping the sidewalk behind me. Wyatt. He hadn't even put a coat on. He threw his arms around me, and I held him and told him it was all right. It wasn't his fault. None of it was his fault. He pulled back, and his eyes were too old for his face, and he said, real quiet, "Grandma, don't tell them I told you anything." Then I felt his hand dart into my coat pocket, and he whispered, "Read it when you're alone." From up the driveway, Bridget's voice cut through the dark, calling his name, Sharp. He squeezed my hand once and ran back. I watched her catch his arm and pull him inside, and the door shut, and the street was quiet again, and I stood there in the cold with a folded piece of paper burning a hole in my pocket. I didn't read it on the bus. I'm not sure why. Maybe I was afraid. I sat in the back with my hands in my lap and watched the dark farmland slide past the window, and somewhere in there the tears finally came, the quiet kind, and I let them. By the time I climbed the stairs to my apartment and turned on the kitchen light, my hands had stopped shaking and something harder had settled into place behind my ribs. I sat down at the table and unfolded the note. The handwriting was a 10-year-old's, all uneven and pressed too hard. It said, "Grandma, don't sign anything. Dad told Mom you won't even remember signing it. Please don't sign." I read it 3 times. Then I sat very still for a long while, and the pieces I hadn't let myself look at started lining up. 3 months back, Trevor had asked, all casual, whether I'd gotten my affairs in order. 2 months back, Bridget had wondered aloud whether I ever thought about letting someone help with the bills, so I didn't have to worry. Just a few weeks back, Trevor had mentioned how smart it was for older folks to set up paperwork ahead of time just in case. I'd nodded along to all of it. I hadn't thought a thing of it. But a child had risked getting in trouble to push a note into my pocket, which meant he'd heard something at that house that scared him. Something he understood was wrong, even if he didn't have the words for it. And it made me think about the thing nobody in that family knew. Because when Edward and I sold Sullivan's Hardware, the story I let everyone believe, that I'd pocketed a modest sum and gone quietly into a small life, was only the surface of it. The truth was sitting in a filing cabinet across town in the office of the one man I trusted to tell me what was really happening. So the next morning, before I'd even finished my coffee, I called Harold Brennan and asked if he could see me that day. Harold had been Edward's attorney for the better part of 25 years, since back when he used to come into the store for a particular kind of cabinet hinge he could never find anywhere else. He's older now, white-haired, slow getting up out of his chair, but his eyes are exactly as sharp as they ever were. When I sat down across from his desk and told him I thought my own family might be trying to trick me into signing something, the warmth went right out of his face and he said, "Tell me, all of it." So I did. The dinner, the shelter, the silence from my daughter, the boy running out into the cold, the note. Harold read Wyatt's handwriting twice and set it down very gently, the way you'd set down something fragile. "Maeve," he said, "has anyone actually put a document in front of you yet?" "Not yet," I told him. "But they'd been asking. About wills. About letting someone help." He nodded slowly. "That's the language people use right before they introduce a power of attorney. Or," and here he paused, "guardianship." I asked him what the difference was. "A power of attorney," he explained, "is something you sign willingly. You give another person the legal right to handle your money for you. Once it's signed, that person can move funds, sell property, do nearly anything with your accounts. Guardianship is worse," he said. "That's when someone goes to a court and argues that you're no longer competent to manage your own affairs and asks the judge to put them in charge of you. Your money, your home, your medical decisions, all of it. And the easiest way to win a guardianship case," Harold said, "is to build a record. To gather up little moments that make a person look confused, unstable, incapable, to get other people to say they're worried about her." He let that sit. "A dinner, for instance, where the woman gets so upset she storms out in front of witnesses." I felt cold all over. I told him about the way Roland and Marlene had watched me, like they were there to see something. Then Harold got up slow and went to a locked cabinet in the corner, and he came back with a thick folder I recognized, and just the sight of it brought Edward back so sharply I had to look away for a second. Harold opened it and turned it to face me. "You remember what we set up," he said. I did. Most people thought selling a hardware store on Main Street in a town like Glenwood meant a tidy little check and nothing more. But Edward had never trusted money he couldn't see working. When the sale closed, we didn't just deposit it. Harold helped us divide it carefully. A good portion went into a long-term investment account that had done nothing but grow for 8 years. Another piece bought the 40 acres of farmland east of town that we'd been renting out to a family that grew soybeans on it, land that paid us a lease check every fall like clockwork, and the rest sat inside a trust Edward had set up with my name on it, the kind of thing designed to protect a person and pass cleanly to the next generation. Harold tapped the bottom of a page. "All told, Maeve, as of this quarter, you're worth a little over $3.5 million. I'll be honest with you, hearing the number out loud still felt like it belonged to someone else. I take the bus. I clip coupons out of the Sunday paper. I bought the coat Trevor sneered at 12 years ago, and I see no reason to replace it. But that was the whole point. Edward and I had agreed, way back, that money was something you held quietly. You didn't wear it. You didn't announce it. The thing is," Harold said, closing the folder, "almost nobody knows this exists." "Does Bridget?" "Not the real shape of it," I told him. "She knew I'd sold the store. She thought what everyone thought. Then if Trevor has suddenly gotten very interested in your finances," Harold said, "it means one of two things. Either he suspects there's more than there appears to be, or he's already found a thread and started pulling it." He looked at me steadily. "What do you want to do?" I asked him what I should do, and he surprised me. He leaned back and said, "For right now, nothing." I started to argue, and he held up a hand. "If they believe you're frightened and weak and easy, they'll move faster and they'll get sloppy. People who think they've already won stop being careful. Let them think you went home and cried and gave up. And when they reach for it, and they will, we'll be standing right there." Then he added one more thing, the thing that mattered most later. He told me that Indiana is a one-party consent state. That means if I'm part of a conversation, I'm legally allowed to record it without telling the other person. "I'm not telling you to go looking for trouble," he said. "But if trouble comes to you on the telephone, there's no reason your phone shouldn't be on." So I went home and I did the hardest thing of my life, which was nothing. I didn't call Bridget. I didn't send an angry message. I let the silence stand and I waited and I watched. 3 days later, Harold called me himself. He'd done some quiet checking, the kind a lawyer knows how to do. There had been an inquiry filed with the county the week before, asking what documentation would be needed to declare an elderly relative incapable of managing her own finances. The inquiry didn't have to name anyone, he said, so it didn't, but he'd looked at the timing. The question had been asked 2 days before that dinner, 2 days before, which told me finally and completely that the supper had never been about reconnecting. It had been a test, a staging. They'd wanted to see me get upset in front of witnesses, and I'd given them exactly what they ordered, and then I'd walked out like a woman too unstable to be trusted with her own checkbook. That evening my phone rang again, and the number was one I didn't know, and when I answered, a small voice said, "Grandma?" It was Wyatt. He'd borrowed a friend's phone, he whispered. His mom didn't know. I asked him if he was all right, and he said yes, but he wanted to tell me something. He'd heard his dad on the phone with somebody, talking about how the business was underwater, how Trevor owed money to people who weren't being patient about it anymore. And he'd heard his dad say that his own folks didn't have any left to give, that they'd already remortgaged their house once to bail him out, and there was nothing more to squeeze there. And then he said, Wyatt's voice dropped so low I had to press the phone to my ear. He said Grandma's sitting on a pile and doesn't even know it. He said if you'd just sign, it'd all be over. Then I heard a door somewhere on his end, and he said he had to go and the line went dead. I sat there a long time after that. So that was the shape of it. Trevor's business was failing, drowning in debt he couldn't outrun. His own parents had nothing left because they'd already poured it into him once. And somewhere along the line, he'd gotten the idea that his quiet, bus-riding, coupon-clipping mother-in-law had more than she let on, and he'd decided the cleanest way to get at it was to make a court believe I couldn't be trusted with it myself. He didn't want to ask me for help. He wanted to take the decision away from me entirely. It came the following week, and it came almost exactly the way Harold said it would. Bridget called, and her voice was doing that bright, rehearsed thing again, and she said maybe we'd all gotten off on the wrong foot, that Trevor felt terrible, that they just wanted to make sure I was taken care of as I got older. And then she said it. They'd had a lawyer draw up some simple paperwork, just a precaution, just so somebody could help with things if I ever had a bad day. Could she bring it by for me to sign? Nothing major, she said. Just a formality. My phone was already recording. I'd had it sitting on the table, set to record every time it rang for a week. I kept my voice gentle and a little vague the way they wanted me to sound. I asked her what kind of paperwork. She said power of attorney, just in case. I asked her, did Trevor put her up to this? She paused, just a beat too long, and then she said it was both of them, that Trevor only wanted to protect the family, and that honestly, with the trouble his business was in, it would mean the world if I could free up some of what I have just to get them through. There it was, on the record in my daughter's own voice. I told her I'd think about it. She said, "Don't think too long, Mom," and there was an edge under the sweetness now, a real one. I took that recording straight to Harold, and I watched his face as he listened to it, and when it ended, he took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes and said, "Well, they've shown their hand." Then he went to work, and I'll tell you, it was a quiet kind of thing to watch a careful man protect you. He sent formal notice to every institution connected to my accounts. No transactions, no inquiries, no changes of any kind without direct confirmation from me and from him together. He locked the trust down tight. He documented the recording and the county inquiry and Wyatt's note, though he was careful, very careful, never to put that boy's name anywhere a soul could find it, because I told him in no uncertain terms that whatever happened, my grandson was never to take the fall for any of it. And then he drafted a letter on his firm's letterhead, addressed to Trevor and Bridget, that laid out in plain legal language exactly what I knew, exactly what I had, and exactly what would happen if either of them ever again attempted to misrepresent my mental competence to any court or institution. I didn't have to be there when they got it. I heard about the aftermath in pieces, mostly from Wyatt and eventually from Bridget herself. The letter landed like a brick through a window. Trevor, from what I gather, blamed everyone but himself. He blamed his parents for panicking. He blamed Bridget for being too soft. Most of all, he blamed me, insisted I'd tricked them, that I'd played helpless on purpose. And the awful, satisfying truth of it was that nobody had forced him to say a single word at that table. Nobody had made him call me a freeloader in front of my own grandson. He'd shown all of them exactly who he was, and now there was a lawyer's letter making sure he couldn't pretend otherwise. The debts didn't wait for anyone. Within a couple of months, Trevor's business folded for good, the truck went back to the bank, and the marriage came apart not in some screaming finale, but in a slow, grinding silence. Bridget told me later that the thing that finally broke it was Trevor saying to her, "If your mother had just signed, none of this would have happened." She said she stood there in the kitchen and realized he'd never once said he was sorry. Not for the business, not for the lie, not for what he'd had her do to her own mother. She asked him to leave. He left. She came to my apartment a few weeks after that, stood in my doorway looking like she'd aged 10 years, and when I let her in, she sat at my little table and cried in a way I hadn't seen since her father's funeral. She said she didn't know how she'd let it get that far, that she'd told herself she was protecting the family, that Trevor had a way of making the wrong thing sound reasonable until you were already standing in the middle of it. I'm not going to pretend I made it easy on her. I didn't. I told her that her silence at that table had hurt me worse than anything Trevor said, because Trevor was never mine to count on, and she didn't argue. She just said, "I know," and we sat with that for a long time. Forgiveness, I've learned, isn't a moment. It's a thing you build back one Saturday at a time. And the Saturdays did come back. Wyatt started showing up every week, riding the bus across town on his own the same way I always had. And one morning he walked in with a sack of flour under his arm and announced that it was time he learned to make the cobbler himself. The same cobbler that got mocked at that table. We dusted the whole kitchen white and he leveled off the flour with the back of a knife, very gravely, telling me you have to be exact or the whole thing falls apart, and I had to turn toward the sink so he wouldn't see my face. Word gets around in a town like Glenwood, the way it always has. Somebody at the senior center heard I'd run Sullivan's Hardware all those years, and one thing led to another, and a woman who organizes the Saturday market on the courthouse square asked if I'd ever thought about selling baked goods. I laughed at first, but the thought stuck. With a little of the money Edward worked so hard to protect. Money that was always, in the end, going to be mine to decide about. I rented a small stall, and then a tiny storefront 2 doors down from where the hardware store used to be. Nothing grand. 4 little tables, a coffee urn, a glass case. I called it Sullivan's again, because that name had been good to this town once, and I figured it could be again. Wyatt designed the chalkboard out front. Bridget came in on her days off and learned to work the register the way she had as a girl on her upturned bucket. The very first thing I ever sold there was a slice of that peach cobbler. The recipe a grown man once told me wasn't worth the table it sat on. There's a line for it most mornings now. A few evenings ago I was closing up. Wyatt was wiping down the tables and Bridget was counting the drawer, and I was sliding the last pan of cobbler into the case. And Wyatt pulled out the chair at the little table by the window, the one that catches the last of the afternoon light, and he looked at me and he said, "This one's yours, Grandma. This is where you sit." I had to hold on to the counter for a second, because the last time a chair was pulled out for me at a family table, a man told me to go beg at a shelter, and not one of the people who were supposed to love me said a word. And now here I was, in my own place, with my own name on the window, and a boy was saving me the best seat in the house. I've thought a lot about what I learned from all of it, and it comes down to this. The people who try hardest to take control of you are usually the ones who've already decided you're weak. They mistake your kindness for helplessness. They mistake your patience for permission. But staying quiet is not the same as being powerless. And I was quiet for a very long time because I loved my family and I didn't want to make a scene. I let myself be made small because I thought that was the price of keeping the peace. It isn't. Love should never cost you your dignity, and family should never ask you to hand over who you are just to keep everyone comfortable. Standing up for yourself doesn't mean you've stopped loving anybody. Sometimes it just means you finally remembered to love yourself too. So, I'll ask you the same thing I asked at the start. If you'd been the one at that table, the night someone you raised sat silent while you were called a freeloader in your own family's home, would you have walked out the way I did, or would you have stayed and fought? Tell me down in the comments because I read them, everyone. And if this story meant something to you tonight, do an old woman a favor and give it a like, and stay close because there's always another story coming. We're not as easy to throw away as some folks think, and the strongest seat at any table is the one you build for yourself.